Hey there, welcome to Empathetic Educators, where we are looking for ways to better understand our brain, to empower our thoughts, and empower our actions. There are two different formats to listen to this show, either audio only on our podcast, or with the video on my YouTube channel. The links are in the post. Remember, you can take part in the conversation by using hashtag buzzinbrains or hashtag challengechangecreate. Today we are very lucky to have the amazing Barbara Oakley, who is an educator, a writer, and an engineer, to name but a few things. She has had an action-packed life, which I'll post a link to in my blog. Barbara has a wee course called Learn How to Learn, which you may have heard of, and I'll put up a link to that in the blog post as well. Over 2 million people have taken this course, and I am excited to share Barbara talking about this more in our session. Enjoy!
Hi, Naomi. Can you hear me?
Hey, Barbara, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Perfect, that's great. Thank you so much.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
How have you been?
Pretty good.
Busy?
Yeah, but then aren't we all?
Yeah.
Yes.
I was actually just from learning how to learn. It was really nice to hear that you were here in New Zealand a long time ago, weren't you?
Yes. Yep.
Yeah.
My husband and I were married in Akaroa, and so we're very excited to be able to go back there after all these years.
And is he coming with you whenever you're coming here?
Yes.
Oh, lovely.
Yeah.
I was just looking at one of my favorite things that I've learned from doing the learn how to learn is the fact that sleep's really good for you. So next to eating is probably one of my favorite things. So sleep's definitely the next favorite thing after that. So it's really cool the fact that the brain gets rid of stuff, like stuff that you don't need. What I was curious about whenever I was listening to it was how does it know what to keep and how does it know what to get rid of? Could you maybe give our listeners a bit of an insight into that? Because it's quite cool the fact it knows and retains stuff, but then it gets rid of the bad stuff as well.
Oh, that's a very good question. So first, let's just quickly go over the two things that sleep does that we know of that are really valuable in learning. The first thing it does is when you're awake during the day, you're putting out your cells are putting out all these little metabolites. Basically, they're like toxins that accumulate in your brain, and that's why by the time evening comes around, you can be pretty mentally fatigued. And so you might think, well, why doesn't the cerebral fluid just sort of wash those toxins away? And because they're kind of expelled from the cells, but they're just kind of sitting around there. And the reason that those little poisons can't be expelled is just that the neurons themselves are kind of like big boulders. They block the flow of the fluid. But recently, researchers have found a very interesting and very simple mechanism that occurs when you're sleeping. And it is, as soon as you fall asleep, your brain cells shrink. So they get smaller, and that means that the cerebral fluid can wash by much more easily, and that washes the toxins away. So for those who think, well, golly, I don't need to get a good sleep tonight, I should study for the test all night instead, what they're essentially doing is setting themselves up with a poisoned brain to take the test the next day. And of course, they're not going to be nearly as efficient or effective in taking the test. Now, the second thing that sleep does is we used to think that learning just occurs when you're paying attention.
Yeah.
But actually, as much of learning occurs when you're not paying attention, and also especially when you're asleep. So when you go to sleep, that's when these little synaptic connections between neurons form. So it's the connections that actually is the learning. And so you're starting your learning during the day, but when you go to sleep at night, these little spikes kind of jut out of your neurons. They're called dendritic
Mm,
spines,
yeah,
and they kind of bump up against the next, an axon, or the axon bumps against the dendritic spine, and together they make a kind of a connection between neurons. And a good solid connection is the foundation of learning. So let's say you're learning a guitar chord. What you've actually done is made a number of connections between neurons in your brain. But these connections actually form during the night when you're asleep. And that's another reason why sleep is so important. Now, your question is, how does the brain know what to keep?
yeah, that's the part that
And
baffles me. Yeah.
well, that's a great question. Part uh, Neuroscientists really don't, as far as I know the answer to this question, because
Okay.
it involves intention.
Yeah.
And how does the brain know your intention to want to figure something out, for
Yeah.
example? But there, we do know that the brain it sends these little rippling waves through the night in the neurons that are most relevant to kind of what you've really been focusing on in your learning and studies, especially if you review it again right before you go to sleep.
Say parents wanted to practice like their times tables, whatever, like that's something they want to do with their children. Could it be something they have like a little game before they go to bed, like maybe the way that you set it up? And because I think the way that I've grown up is very much like rote learning, repeated, 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 sit down, do this. And I think that's what we're talking to parents about. That's It's not the fact it's no homework, it's just the fact it might look different. So like it might be playing games to practice your math times tables, it might be doing different things like that. So it's not as much we're sending homework, this is what it has to complete by Monday. It's more like different ways of still learning. And I think that's like that really focused and intentional part. But then if the kids are doing that the whole way through the day, if that's what the parents have gone through in education and they're expecting their children to do that, we're trying just to change that mindset towards it might look a bit different towards what they've done whenever they're growing up. And then that would help that way then, yeah.
Oh, yes. And it sounds like your approach to homework is actually just the perfect one. Whether or not you call it homework, you can actually make the kinds of ideas that are normally taught through homework to seem almost like fun. And students want to do that sort of thing. And boy, it sounds like I want my grandchildren to go to your school.
we're still definitely learning and we're still definitely looking and seeing what's important. But yeah, we're trying.
There's an aspect of learning that's rarely addressed, and that relates to the two very different networks that neuroscientists and cognitive psychologists know exist in the brain, and they're very relevant to learning. And the first network, I'll call it the focused mode. um, Psychologists call it the task positive network. In other words, a task is sort of activated. And this is the mode that's activated when you're just focusing on a topic in particular. Like, let's say you're solving a math problem or you're trying to conjugate a verb in French. So you're activating a certain specific area of your brain as you're, or more specific, that your whole brain has always got stuff going on in there. Um, but the other mode is it's a more diffuse network, and so I'll call it the diffuse mode. And with this mode, it's you're not focusing on anything in particular. You're often, so for example, let's say you're standing in the shower. Well, you're not usually standing in the shower trying to solve a math problem. But you may be loosely thinking about some idea, or you're riding on the bus or going for a walk or something like that. And this very different set of neural networks is much more wide ranging in the brain. And when we're learning, as so let's say we pretty much know something, and it's it's a slight tweak on what we already know. So let's say we know how to multiply, and we're asked to multiply 24 times 77. So we get out a piece of paper, or maybe we can work it in our heads, and we start to multiply because we kind of know how to multiply.
Mm.
But let's say that we know multiplication, but we don't know division. So how do you learn something new? Often you first begin by groping around and making all these mistakes because you're falling back on focus mode patterns you already know. But then when you walk away and you kind of get your mind off it, so you're not focusing on it anymore, that opens the diffuse mode, this other network that's much more wide ranging. And then your thoughts can kind of dart around in this much more wide ranging way and allow you to solve a problem or begin to understand a new concept. So this is very relevant. I mean, there's great research that shows that if you have a kid focus all the time, with no breaks, you're actually inhibiting
Mhm.
that child's ability to really understand the material. Because when the mind isn't on it, when the mind is more relaxed, what's actually happening is, as you were learning things, you were kind of copying some ideas and patterns and so forth into your hippocampus, the neurons in your hippocampus. When you relax, your hippocampus is in turn teaching that out to the places in long-term memory where you're storing that information and your understanding of that information. That takes place, that sort of teaching out into the sort of the ultimate place where that long-term memory will reside. That happens when you're relaxing or when you're not focusing on something.
Mm.
And so that's why it can be valuable to have like little active breaks sometimes when you're teaching. Teach for a little while, then give the students kind of a little active break where they're maybe talking to one another about the topic, but they're not working hard trying to focus on you or focus really hard on something in particular.
I think that's kind of what we do. We're trying to introduce into our learning, but a lot of the time, sometimes you might be thinking, "Oh, they're just messing around." Like we have to get back to the learning. What are your views on that?
Oh, I can really understand. I can empathize with educators who say that we need to get back to the educating, because um, oftentimes you do have a lot of material to cover.
Mhm.
And when kids are kind of just messing around, I mean, what's the trade-off there? Because obviously you can't cover the material if they're just messing around doing something else. And I think, um, this is a bit of the art of teaching.
Mhm.
It's sort of like, how much direct instruction should I give them before I back away and let them kind of either gnaw at it on their, on their own or with friends, or take a little break, maybe a physical break. How much time should I give for that? Research evidence just shows that it is helpful to have a little bit of a break here and there. So I think good teachers are aware of that, and maybe they give their break through, allowing students to take a few minutes of their own time, or maybe the teacher tells a funny story that sort of takes their mind off it and allows them to relax and process what they've just been hearing. So it seems like technically you're still teaching the whole time, but you have these little periods where it's much less intense mentally, and
So, so it doesn't have to be like they're going off and playing outside. It could just be that they're taking a break from the actual intense part of it.
right,
It doesn't have to be that
right.
it's actually just going completely off it. And is it with the diffuse mode, like whenever it's just going through and naturally occurring, does it have like same as sleep? It kind of makes a question. How does it?
Oh.
Can you intentionally make it diffuse, or does the brain just naturally like? Does that just naturally is that natural process that happens in the brain?
Well, diffuse mode, well, focus mode, you can make yourself
Yeah.
focus. I
Yeah.
mean, if you're really tired, you can't focus that long. Your brain will kind of wander away eventually, but you can make yourself focus. But it's a little like, I mean, going into diffuse mode is a little like falling asleep.
Mm,
I mean, you can want to fall asleep,
yeah.
but that little thing where you fall asleep,
Yeah.
that's like not under your physical or mental control.
Yeah.
Uh, um, but you can set things up to go into diffuse mode by simply, walking around, or they always say the bed, the bath, and the bus is the so riding on a vehicle while you're kind of just looking out, yeah, or falling asleep at night. Your mind begins to wander, kind of free of things.
It's so true. Actually, like me just thinking about stuff. Because actually, one of my friends from work, she came in. She's like, "I had this dream last night. I had a dream. I woke up, had to write it all down. I had, I had like in her book. It was actually called her idea dream, and she had like she made like that this big thing that she's been trying to focus on, trying to like connect with. And then she came in. She's like, "I got it. I think I've actually done it in my sleep. It just came together. It's actually her brain just being relaxed and her just like going with it, and that's like the bad part of it. It's like it's quite cool the way your brain just has that natural process, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And the brain so often uses metaphor as a way of kind of coming up with new ideas that are relevant not only to your learning, but your life. It's almost like the brain um, operates in terms of metaphor.
Mm.
So sometimes you'll just get these remarkable insights, and they just come from the metaphor of dreams.
It's so strange. Like it's so cool. Like it's like affect our brain. 'Cause I was talking to someone else in an interview a couple of weeks ago, and we were saying that actually who's in control is that like our brains just doing it rather than us actually controlling it doing it. So it's so strange, isn't it?
Oh, it is. Well, one thing I should add, though, is that metaphor is actually one of the most powerful tools that I feel educators can use. When you're trying to explain a new idea, if you already have the neural circuitry developed for one concept, let's say that it's how of how water flows. Well, you've already got that concept down, and it seems easy to you as an adult, but to a baby, trust me, it was not easy.
Mhm.
And so if you use that concept of flow of water as an analogy for the flow of electrical current, you can get the idea of electrical current flow across much more rapidly, even if the metaphor is not exact or accurate. I mean, electrons flow one way, positive particles flow the other way. At a quantum level, it doesn't work at all. But
The
but for the
concept
part,
of
yeah, for the part, when you're trying to get those fundamental ideas across, if you already have a set of neural circuits you've developed that can kind of serve as a bridge to a new set of somewhat similar neural circuits, it can help learners just onboard students so much more rapidly.
well, it's given a visual towards something they already know, isn't it? So it's like they're making that connection. They can see it. They can almost see what you mean, rather
Yeah.
than like that's the so whenever you say metaphor, like just for our listeners, just to kind of like give them an example, just in case, like it's just to let them know it's making that connection, isn't it, between like the water and then the electric. So like they're actually visualizing it.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep. And it's something the way I'm using it, it's a connection between something you already know and something you don't know.
Yeah.
So you can say, um, history unfolds like a river.
Mhm.
It's got the streams that are flowing out. It's a beautiful metaphor, but it also helps you um, see life in a new way, because you're relating something you do know to something that is that you're trying to think about in a novel way.
Mm. Actually, really, because I use a lot of visuals and a lot of like trying to connect what I'm saying through visual. But actually, that's really nice to actually auditorily make that visual as well.
You want to be kind of peeking at the material from lots of different angles. So even if you're doing the multiplication tables, you don't have them sitting there going, oh, 4 times 2 is 8, 4 times 2 is 8, over and over and over again. You're looking at 4 times 2 is 8, and then, oh, now, and you've just done a bunch of others, now you're revisiting 4 times 2 is 8. Oh, now I'm revisiting it in the form of a essay problem, that involves four apples that I'm going to throw at two of my friends. How many apples do I need, or whatever, or let's call them something softer. So perhaps eggs, if you really want to be a little devilish. Uh, um, but it's, you want to practice a lot, but kind of with varying contexts.
Yeah.
It's sort of like saying, well, if somebody's going to learn to back up a car, do they need to practice? I mean, if they just understand it, that's good enough.
Mm.
Surprisingly often, even deeply abstract concepts like mathematics are very much akin to learning to back up a car, because they're growing from the real physical world. So that's why practice can be so valuable.
And I think that's because in my school we have a lot of language for learning as well. So we have like building our knowledge and then making your meaning and then applying understanding. So that's like you're practicing, and but then you're making your meaning in different contexts. So like it looks different and comparing and contrasting in different ways. And then you're actually applying the understanding that you've done in different places and then putting it into action as well yourself. So that process is really important, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah. It sounds like you're doing everything's just right. And that's what keeps things fresh for kids.
Mhm.
I, I think maybe every child has different motivations, but for some kids, um, I think an interesting thing we should bring up here is differing working memory capacity in children.
Mm.
And that makes a big difference in how we teach kids. Um, High working memory capacity it makes it easier for a kid to learn something. They can hold it in mind. They can often seem to stick it in long-term memory much more easily. But kids with lower capacity working memory, they have to work harder, but they can actually do not only as well, but even better than the kid with the higher working capacity working memory. And it's because um, they have to find ways to kind of um, put part of their thinking off into long-term memory, and that takes a longer period of time to do. But once they've done that, they can see these sort of elegant simplifications. They can put even really tough material together in their brain and figure things out that even the high working memory capacity student can't do, or can't do very easily. So the thing is, though, really smart educators often want to teach in a way that would have made them happy as younger children. So that means they don't like to have the idea of much repetition, because they sure didn't need it, and they think it's really harmful for kids. But research evidence is showing that if you have a lower capacity working memory, extra practice and repetition is enormously helpful.
Yeah.
And so kids with good working memories, they're going to thrive no matter what you throw at them. They're kind of like dandelions. They're going to do great. But kids with lower capacity working memory, they're like orchids. You got to be a little more nurturing, give them a little bit more practice, and so forth, and then they'll thrive.
And I think sometimes there's a disconnect between what practice looks like. Do you know, like practice and repetition doesn't mean. I think it's just the rote learning. I think there's a lot of times when practice and repetition can go along with rote learning, and I think that's where there's like a disconnect between understanding. It doesn't have to be that it's rote learning, just sitting there doing that repetition, repetition, repetition. It can be repeating like you say, in different contexts, in different settings, in different places, and that's actually more valuable than, because even for me, knowing me myself as a learner, I was like probably one of the higher working memory capacity. Like I had a
Mhm.
higher version, but actually my long-term memory isn't half as good as people who said they've struggled towards having to learn things, because like you say, it's having to make those connections and having to intentionally put it in rather than just like getting it like that and using it, getting it and using it. I think that's the difference, isn't it, between the higher working memory and like maybe the lower working memory?
Well, I think so. A higher capacity working memory, they can just hold more in mind at once. So, for example, if a lecture, or let's say you've got your teacher teaching along, and the person with the higher working capacity working memory can be taking notes even while they're understanding what the professor is saying.
Okay.
The person with the lower capacity working memory, they can either take notes or they can concentrate on the teacher, what the teacher's saying, but they can't do both at the same time. It's like just writing the notes down takes up so much of their working memory that they can't be like also analyzing what the meaning of what the teacher is saying is. And so, so it's really harder. I mean, people with lower capacity working memories, they basically have to often just be stenographers while the teacher's talking, and then go home and figure it out at their own speed, which is slower.
So that would be a really great takeaway for teachers. Like, say we did have children, and obviously we have a lot of children and who need that extra support. If it was like, rather than taking notes and concentrating on what they have to do, what could we set up as like little intervals for that, like to try and enhance them with the, instead of them just having listened to us? What have you seen any really good things that be put in place towards helping that transfer in that situation? Like, would visuals help? Would checklists help? Like, what would you think?
Oh, that's a very good question. Um, so what research shows is that actually, if you have a low capacity working memory, if you borrow somebody else's notes while you sit and actually watch and try and understand, you'll do better by doing that. But the student has to be motivated to do that. So if, let's say, you handed out notes to all the students, well, if you did that, then some students would just say, well, I don't need to pay attention at all. So it's almost it's the art of teaching there to, what does this child need?
Doesn't work for it.
And if so, but it can definitely be helpful. If you have a motivated student who just can't do both at the same time, you just tell them to concentrate on you, and then use the notes from their friend, who's obviously someone who's a good note taker and can handle this kind of thing, and that can be a helpful thing. Another thing is, if you have a student who's got attentional difficulties, the more you can help that student to become actively involved as members of the class.
Yeah.
So if there's something you can do that's physical during the, I mean, it isn't physical kinds of things aren't just elementary school. I mean, physics is the concept of physics has, or the subject of physics has, the right hand rule, and you have to sit there with the right hand and watch, watch as these vectors are changing direction. And the more you can kind of devise actual physical things that are somehow related, students, I think, with attentional difficulties they can grab that more easily. Of course, um, anything with imagery, the brain is geared for imagery.
Mhm.
So something like 50% of the brain of those synaptic connections in the brain are somehow related to the visual systems. And so the more you can make something visual, the more you can make it so that students can stick it more easily in long-term memory. Mark Twain had, the famous American writer, his daughters were trying to learn the kings and queens of England, and they they were really struggling. They'd been struggling all summer, and finally he he went out and he measured their driveway for like 830 feet, and every foot was a year. and then he'd measure along and say, okay, here's William the Conqueror. And he'd put a little sign, like with a whale, for W. And here by the stairs, there's William the Conqueror, and he'd measure out how many steps. That's how many years of his reign. And then he'd put a little stake and a picture for the next, um, uh, you know, ruler and so forth. And within days, his kids could say, oh, yeah, that's Queen Elizabeth. She's down by the apple orchard. And and they could cite her the years of her reign and so forth. And making things really visual or spatial is just an invaluable way of. And you might think, well, oh, you don't need to look up the years of the kings and queens of the various kings and queens of England. You can always look it up, but the thing is, you can't always look it up. I mean, would you know French if you were using Google Translate? And likewise, those facts related to what's going on in English history, well, then he started putting a stake on the other driveway and kind of saying, okay, this is when um, the telegraph was invented. This is when all these big inventions, when they were invented, and major rulers and kings and so forth around the world, and they started to see the patterns and the connections, and they could only do that because they had the facts within their brain, not that they were just kind of, I'll just go look it up.
Big thing I'm trying to acquire this year, reading and writing. Because like you were saying about the oral language, and it's not our natural way of processing in the brain. And I think a lot of my learners that I found, it's a big barrier to them trying to write on paper their actual their outcomes. So they might, it's really cool the way technology is put in now towards like voice to type and getting your ideas out as well. Because when I was talking to Mark Treble about oral language, and like the future is going to be a lot about like video. So like we watch a lot of our content through YouTube now, and that's what, like, it's going to be very oral that we're learning as well. But then I took a reflection towards reading. Like you can't understand what someone's talking about without knowing what they're talking about. It comes back to knowledge as well. Like you'd have to be able to have a basis of what the video is talking about to be able to understand what it's happening. So do you think is there a connection between actually physically reading and creating oral contact? Because obviously oral is better for our brain and taking it in, because that's what we're used to, evolutionary. But what do you think is the connection between reading and that YouTube intake and the video intake? What is there connections between that, do you think?
Oh, that's another good question. I think it's a lot easier for students to learn with YouTube. I mean, if you have any given thing and it's well presented on video, I mean, it's like an elevator speech. It's quick, it's fast paced, it keeps your interest. That's a great way to onboard a student onto a topic. But students also need to be taught to use those periods, to be able to use those periods of quiet reflection to actually read. And because reading is, it is an invaluable tool to help them with their future. So I think a combination of both things that doesn't say, oh, everything's got to be fun and sparky online, but uh, but but also that realizes that fun and sparky online can be helpful for many of the students you most want to reach, but then gradually onboarding them or appealing to their ability to go a little deeper and to start thinking more abstractly with reading materials. That's great teaching too. And so I think sometimes it's in people's self-serving best interest to say, oh yeah, that online material, that's just all quick and cheap and, superficial. And actually it is not necessarily that way at all. In fact, in our Learning How to Learn course, I mean, 2.5 million people around the world have watched that course, and they get things out of it that they don't get from other sources. So for example, my daughter was in medical school, third year of medical school, and she filmed one of the little video snippets where she was in her headphones, and she was modeling blocking out sound with headphones. And she went to class about 3 months after the course had come out, and her professor was this advanced cardiologist, a preeminent expert in the field of cardiology, and in Southeast Michigan. And so he was teaching away, suddenly stops the class, points right at her, and says, "You, you were in that MOOC." And so here's this advanced professional
Yeah.
who's, I mean, you don't think some preeminent cardiologist is going to sit around and watch, something that's trivial. I mean, he was getting a lot out of it. He actually watched the whole MOOC and recognized our daughter in it.
Yeah. I think from what I think I'm on like the second week two, I think it is, and but I think what works really well with your videos is the visuals and like it's entertaining value. Like whenever you talk about the Antarctic, and then you like, my favorite part's whenever you go and sleep is good for you, and then like you see you go. It's
I was like, should I do this? Should I do it? Okay, I'm going to do it.
yeah,
Yeah.
like but that's like the connection piece, like you're saying about the metaphors, and like you can really see it. Like I think sometimes the content is just like take, but like from yours, it's like making those connections. It's like the intentionality behind it, and like you say, if it's made well, then it's going to make you think and going to make you make those connections. Sometimes you can watch a video and it's just like you're like just listening, and you're not making those connections through the intentionality of the creator. And I think that's what's really good about it, because I've loved it. It's more, it's like entertaining value as well. Like that's, you making the connections and you're not just sitting there. You're like, but it's like keeping you engaged because of that, like that funny piece. And was that the sleep part's definitely one of it's like I'm going to sleep now.
Well, I sometimes say that making great video is a combination of academia with Silicon Valley with Hollywood.
Yeah,
And the old-fashioned professors was like, well, we don't need Hollywood.
yeah,
But the thing is, people like it. And if you help them to enjoy what they're learning,
yeah.
why not?
Having it fun is engaging. Do you know, like if we're trying to do engaging lessons, like the fun part is like the most important part, isn't it? And but it is sometimes, like you say, Hollywood, like you feel comfortable, you're like, should I do it, should I not? Like sometimes teachers might, like, it's a big risk for them to put that way of being as well, isn't it? Like sometimes that's not their way, so maybe that's not right for them. But sometimes teachers are really good at being not Hollywood, and then they get people engaged that way too. But
Some of my favorite teachers, they are the ones who are like these old curmudgeons, and they get on and they're just like, oh man, this is going to be the most boring thing ever. And they're so dry. And then they start cracking these
yeah,
jokes out of the blue. And you're like, where'd that come from? Wait, this guy's actually pretty witty. This is, no. And then you start watching it and enjoying it because you know there's going to be surprises.
yeah, yeah, like it piques your interest towards. I think that's what it is. Isn't it? Good teaching is actually just like making it. It can get a bit like that, and then it goes up again, and then it can get a bit like that, and like it goes up again. So
And, some stuff is just harder to learn. And, but it's kind of like riding a bicycle. Learning is not always fun.
yeah.
But when you learn how to do something, it's pretty cool.
Mm.
And so some things just take longer to learn than like a bicycle, and they're more abstract than a bicycle. You may not fall down and bang your knee, but you have to go through um, some sometimes painful learning processes to get to where it starts to be fun. And this is where great teachers can keep those students motivated and kind of bring in some relevance to their lives. And yeah, I think the more you learn about the brain, the easier it can make your learning.
Yeah, yeah, no, it's been fantastic. It really has. a lot of top tips to take away for this. So no, normally I'll have a little cupcake waiting for it in 2 weeks time, because normally I give like a little cupcake for like the top tips takeaway. So I'll have a little cupcake for you whenever you whenever you come.
All I can say is thank you so much for a great discussion. It's been such a pleasure, and I'm looking forward to seeing you when I get to New Zealand.
Well, thank you so much to Barbara Oakley for your time and your amazing top tips. My biggest takeaway is probably the different modes of learning. It is important for us to allow our brains to take in what we have learned. And that may be in places like she says, like the bath, the bed, or the bus. As you can tell, this was recorded a wee while ago. It was so great to meet Barbara and attend her seminar when she came to New Zealand. I put a link to my reflections, as well as many more resources that might plant some more seeds. Remember, you can get in contact through these different links, including following me on Twitter and using hashtag challengechangecreate or hashtag buzzinbrains. Looking forward to you joining in next Monday. See you then!